Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a high-stakes legal dispute that really exposes the hidden complexities of occupational health and maritime law. It's a fascinating case that went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the Philippines, and it shows us just how absolutely critical the fine print of an employment contract can be. So if you've ever wondered how the legal system untangles, medical diagnoses from actual workplace responsibilities, well, you're definitely in the right place. To understand how a massive payout was ultimately denied on a technicality, we'll be running through a quick agenda. 1. The seafarer's illness. 2. A tale of two doctors. 3. Lower courts side with Ong. 4. Are the illnesses work-related? 5. The third doctor rule. And finally, 6. The Supreme Court's verdict. All right, Section 1, the seafarer's illness, a sudden medical emergency at sea. Our case begins with Mario H. Ong. He was a chief steward and cook who boarded the vessel BW Jimena back in March 2008, and he was fully declared fit for sea duty. His day-to-day job? Managing food supplies, supervising meals, carrying provisions, and sending reports to port authorities. But just a few months into his 9-month contract, things took a pretty sharp turn. Now, this entire legal battle really revolves around one exact figure: $90,000. That's the permanent disability benefit Ong claimed after a sudden medical emergency brought his time at sea to a screeching halt. We're talking dizziness, nausea, recurring headaches, shortness of breath, the works. And that kicked off a massive legal saga for this $90,000 payout. Following those sudden symptoms, Ong was evaluated in Tampa, Florida, diagnosed with uncontrolled diabetes and hypertension, and then immediately sent back to the Philippines for treatment. But I want you to pay close attention to the gap in time between October and January. That seemingly quiet few-month period, that's exactly where the seeds of this entire legal dispute were actually sown. Moving to Section 2, a tale of two doctors. Conflicting medical opinions create a legal dispute. Now, in any medical compensation claim, the professional opinions of the examining physicians are, well, literally everything. But what exactly happens when two doctors look at the exact same patient and draw entirely different conclusions about his fitness to work? For exactly 104 days after his repatriation, the company-designated physicians took over Ong's care. And this wasn't just some brief in-and-out checkup. Over those 104 days, they ran numerous laboratory tests, continuously monitored his condition, and gave him the necessary medications. Finally, at the end of this pretty extensive monitoring period, the company's doctors officially declared him fit to resume his sea duties. But because Ong still felt unwell, he waited over 3 months after that clearance to see a private doctor, a Dr. Antonio Pascual, who immediately declared him unfit. So the core conflict here is the stark difference in testing. We've got an extensive, well-documented assessment backed by months of lab tests from the company doctors, clashing directly with a much later single consultation from a private cardiologist. And honestly, the private doctor's records were totally unclear on how thoroughly he even examined Ong. Which brings us to Section 3, lower courts side with Ong. Initial victories for the seafarer. You see, despite the company doctor's findings, Ong sued for his disability benefits, medical reimbursement, and damages, and initially, the legal system completely agreed with him. The lower courts essentially looked at the calendar, saw that Ong hadn't returned to his customary work for more than 241 days, and ruled that the sheer length of time out of action absolutely justified awarding him the full $90,000. The Court of Appeals later affirmed this, basically adding that the fact Ong still needed medication proved his permanent disability. But before anyone could cut that check, the Supreme Court stepped in with a really critical question. Did his job on the ship actually cause these illnesses? The standard seafarer contract rules require solid proof that illnesses are actually connected to specific work duties. It wasn't just enough that he got sick while under contract. The law demands a causal link. Did managing food supplies and supervising meals actually cause his diabetes and high blood pressure? Let's look at Section 4. Are the illnesses work-related? The legal anatomy of diabetes and hypertension. Here, the Supreme Court had to evaluate Ong's ailments against rigorous maritime employment definitions, which, as you might guess, are far stricter than your everyday medical definitions. Under standard contract rules, neither of these diseases guarantees a payout without substantial proof of work causation or severe permanent organ damage. For hypertension to be compensable, the law requires an element of gravity, meaning it must severely impair the function of organs like the kidneys, heart, eyes, or brain. Ong offered zero proof of that, and as for the diabetes, the court took a very firm stance based on medical science. As the Supreme Court firmly stated, diabetes mellitus does not indicate work-relatedness and, by its nature, is more the result of poor lifestyle choices and health habits for which disability benefits are improper. Basically, it's a metabolic and familial disease. It's the result of genetics, age, and lifestyle, not carrying supplies on a ship. Since Ong couldn't prove his specific work caused the illness, his claim really started to sink. Plus, the court noted that a seafarer can absolutely still be employed while having these conditions, provided they are controlled by maintenance meds, which is exactly what the company doctors achieve. So, Section 5, the third doctor rule, the fatal flaw in Ong's lawsuit. Even with all that debate over his diseases, the absolute turning point of this whole explainer comes down to one mandatory procedural rule. This right here is where Ong's case completely unravels. Because really, what happens when the company's doctor and the seafarer's private doctor completely disagree? Well, the contract actually has a built-in mechanism to resolve exactly this kind of medical standoff, and ignoring it is a fatal legal mistake. You can't just take a conflicting medical certificate and sprint straight to the courthouse. The law requires a tiebreaker. The rules state that if the company doctor in Step 1 and your private doctor in Step 2 completely disagree, then both parties absolutely must jointly agree on a third doctor in Step 3, whose decision is final. Ong completed Step 2, but he bypassed Step 3 entirely, rushing straight to the courthouse instead. And that was a fatal error. Which leads us to Section 6, the Supreme Court's verdict, the final resolution and key takeaways. Because of that skipped step, the highest court stepped in to apply the rigid rules of the contract that both parties originally signed. Ultimately, bypassing the third doctor rule was the final nail in the coffin. Because the proper conflict resolution procedure was totally ignored, the heavily documented initial fit-to-work diagnosis legally stood. On top of his failure to prove the illnesses were work-related or severe enough to cause permanent impairment, the procedural violation just sealed his fate. The Supreme Court set aside all financial awards, and the $90,000 claim was officially dismissed. So it leaves us with a pretty big question. If you were handed a contract with a built-in dispute resolution rule, would you know exactly when to use it before rushing to court? This case is a stark reminder that in the eyes of the law, the medical truth can be completely overwritten by a simple procedural error. Skipping the fine print can literally cost you everything. Thanks for joining me for this explainer. Keep this in mind the next time you sign on the dotted line and stay curious.